Scriptures today speak about God's mercy. We see in the first reading from the book of Wisdom, it says that before the Lord, the whole universe is like a drop of dew that falls to the earth. And yet he has mercy for all. He cares about all. He forgives people's sins. He has mercy on them. We see the beautiful story about Zacchaeus. It's one of my favorite gospels. Zacchaeus is a tax collector. And as you know from last week's gospel, tax collectors were despised people because they stole from their fellow citizens. They were under the employment of Rome and were to collect taxes from the people. But they would often raise the amount of tax so that they could keep it for themselves. They were stealing from people. And so they were really despised. The name tax collector was synonymous with the name sinner. And so Zacchaeus was a person who was really despised by all the people. And if you think about it, he must have been very sad and very lonely. Because how do you go in a crowd and they'd rather push you over and kick you than even acknowledge your presence? That's what Zacchaeus was doing. But he must have heard about Jesus being a friend of sinners and calling them to himself. And he wanted to see this man. And of course, it says in the gospel, he's a short guy, and so he couldn't see him because of his height. And so he ran ahead to climb up a sycamore tree. Must have looked like a monkey in that tree, climbing up a tree and looking for Jesus. Jesus comes by, and he stops. And he looks up at Zacchaeus and says, "Come down. Today I want to stay at your house." What a phenomenal experience it must have been for Zacchaeus as he quickly comes down to the Lord. Something happened to him inside. Something changed him. He's suddenly saying, "Lord, I'll give half of what I own to the poor. I'm a wealthy man. I'll give half of it away." And then he says, "I'll repay 4 times over anybody that I have stolen from." He has a complete change of heart. And Jesus is there with him. So often when we think about God, we always look up. Today the role's reversed. Jesus looks up and he sees Zacchaeus up a tree and out on a limb and in trouble. And he says, "Come down, I want to stay with you today." And I think today when you think about that, we don't need to look up, we just look down. When you go to receive communion today, you're holding in your hands heaven, Jesus himself. We can look down, and do we hear him say those words to us? "I want to stay at your house today." He wants a place in the house of our hearts, and he wants to be with us always. It's a very comforting thought. There's no sin that the Lord will not forgive. The people here didn't see Zacchaeus as Jesus did. There's a story about 2 taxidermists who were taking a walk one day, and they stopped by a storefront where there was an owl perched in the window. And being taxidermists, they looked at it and they started to criticize it. The head was not in proportion to the rest of the body, and the feathers were rather disheveled, and something could be done with the feet. And they're going on and on trying to see what a terrible job this owl was. And before they started to walk away, the owl suddenly turned his head and winked at them. They presumed that it was just a stuffed owl, but inside there was a living owl, and they were only seeing the outside. St. Luke likes to, in his gospel, say that we can't be presumptuous. We can look at someone and see the external. Jesus looks at what's inside. When we see someone who reaches out to us for a cup of coffee, do we just say, "Why don't you go get a job?" Or do we see the inside of somebody who's hungry and hurting, and so we help them? It's what Jesus would do. And that's what we have to always do in imitating Christ. We need to be like he was and see the inside like he saw in Zacchaeus. And it changed Zacchaeus his whole life. We prayed in the beginning of the Mass that the Lord came to call sinners. And he came to heal the contrite of heart. That's you and me. He calls us to a life of holiness, to a life of joy with him. So today in the scriptures, I think we again hear of God's great mercy, and he wants to give it to us when we need it, and he certainly wants to have us give it to others. Today is National Priesthood Sunday, in which we give thanks to God for the gift of the priesthood, for all the men who have become priests, and we thank God for what the priesthood gives to us, the Eucharist primarily. This same Jesus that we read about in the Gospel will be present in a few moments on this altar because of the priesthood. And when I think of the almost 42 years I've been a priest, it's been a wonderful experience because it's through the priesthood that God touches people's lives. When I baptize a baby, when I bury someone, when I witness a marriage, when I anoint someone who's sick, when the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ. It's a humbling experience, but it's also that Christ can be with all of us, and it's a great experience. We have a seminarian today here, Mike Feltz, who's going to say a few words after communion about the priesthood in the seminary and his own experience. I'm very happy that he's here with us today. And I encourage you to continue to pray for vocations to the priesthood. I'm convinced that there's many young men and women in this parish who the Lord is calling to serve as priests and religious women. And we need to pray for them, that they have the courage to seek Jesus like Zacchaeus did, and to hear Jesus say, I want to come and stay at your house today. It's by our prayers that we will have more vocations to the religious life and the priesthood. So please continue to pray, and continue to, don't hesitate when you see a young person who you think would be a good priest or a good religious woman. Don't hesitate to say it to them. You know you're a good person, and maybe God's calling you to serve him in the church. It's a wonderful experience. I wouldn't trade it for the world. All these years of the priesthood, and I don't hesitate to encourage young people. I'm encouraging a number of them in the parish, but they kind of, well, Father, I'll think about it. They immediate rejection. They remind me of myself years ago when I didn't want to do this. But when you follow the Lord and trust him, he has great things in store for us. So today we thank God for the priesthood and for all of his merciful love that comes to us through the sacraments of the church because of the priesthood.